Was there any contact with the outside world there?
None at all, absolutely cut off. And then I was taken to the prosecutor and asked a lot more questions. And one of the things that they got was a report which I'd written for my company. Now, I'd written it when at the start of the contract, well, before the contract, when I went out just for a feasibility study, and I'd written it all up, and it was intended for the company, not intended for the customer. But they got hold of a copy of it because one of my colleagues had stupidly taken a copy out with him and left it lying about, and they managed to get hold of it and made a Xerox copy of it. And I was absolutely startled because I thought, how on earth have they got hold of it? And it had to be like that. And eventually I worked out who was the idiot who took it out there. And they said, why didn't we get a copy of this? So I said, well, you're not allowed a copy of it. I said, it's a report which I produced for my company. You're not on the distribution. You get another report, not this one. And the reason is obvious. The engineer who goes out, I mean, I might propose things which the company may not want to do or may not be able to do. Maybe the MOD won't allow them to do it. Well, you don't talk to your customer about things that can't be done. You tell them what can be done.
And you say you had no contact with the outside world. What about within the prison? What was your relationship like with the guards or other prisoners?
Well, of course, eventually, when I got sentenced, I was told, by the way, that I was sentenced to death. But that, and eventually I wasn't on my own. I was put in, instead of being in solitary, it was the other way round. I was in a room intended for 20 prisoners. There were 47 of us in there. And later on I was in a little room measuring 2 meters square, and there were 5 of us in there. Can you imagine? They put a double bunk bed across the end, one on top bunk, one underneath, and 3 of us sleeping side by side with our feet underneath the bottom bunk. And it's incredible. They talk about our prisons being overcrowded. Libyans, there's no such thing as being overcrowded. You just jam more people in.
Were you the only foreign prisoner?
No, they had lots of... when I was in Judaidah prison, which was in Tripoli, later I was shifted over to Benghazi, to Kafia prison. But in Judaidah, it was like the United Nations in there. There were people from every nationality practically, quite a lot of Eastern Europeans, there were Romanians, and I came across a Czech. There was a Czech prisoner eventually. He was in Benghazi actually, but they had people from everywhere. There were French, lots of Italians.
And you were allowed to talk openly with the prisoners?
Yes, initially. Conditions changed over time, and initially we were all jumbled in regardless of what we'd done. There were murderers and young boys of 14 who'd just been shoplifting, all jumbled up together. But we got a new prison governor in who sorted us all out into different categories of supposed crimes, and I was put in with the political prisoners.
How did they get you out?
Oh, that was much later. Well, once it was realised what had happened to me, we didn't have an embassy because we'd broken off diplomatic relations, but there was a British consul who was in the British interest section of the Italian embassy, and he was concerned with me and with the 2 Scottish prisoners. He told them, look, you've done the wrong thing. If you're trying to get your prisoners in the UK back by holding me, you've done exactly the wrong thing. You'll never get them back this way. You've dug a big hole and you've jumped in it. And But they didn't believe this initially, and they used to say to me quite openly, "Look, Mr. Jim, you have nothing to worry about, because when your stupid Prime Minister realises that she's got to do a swap, then you'll be in exchange of prisoners and you'll be back with your wife and life will be happy for you again." And I said, "It's not going to be like that." I said, "Oh, yes, it will. We've done this with the Germans and the French." So you may have done it with the Germans and the French, but you won't do it with Maggie Thatcher.
The lady's not for turning.
No.
So how did you get out?
Well, and actually she got a message through to me through the consul. His name was Hugh Donaghy, he was a Scotsman. And she told me through him that you've got to take it on the chin. It's tough, but we can't do a deal with them, because if we do a deal like this, they'll just repeat it, and we'll keep on grabbing terrorists, and he'll get them back by grabbing innocent Brits. So, you know, you've got to put up with it. And eventually, after about 3 years, you could tell they were beginning to realise that it wasn't going to happen. And now his problem was how to get rid of me without losing face, because Arab leaders don't like losing face. And so they hit on this idea that he would show his magnanimity by releasing all foreign prisoners. So one day he announced on television that, because he used to come on television every night, Gaddafi's on television lecturing his people, and he came on and said he was going to release all the foreign prisoners. So that included me, and I didn't believe it at first, but they came round. We were all brought out of the prison, and we were in a great yard, and they brought along all the reporters and TV cameras, and they were all searching for me, and I tried to duck behind all the other prisoners, but they found me, and they started asking me, so what do you think of our great leader of the revolution now? And I said, well, I'm glad he's letting me out, you know. But what do you think of him? I said, well, I'm glad he's decided to, but I wasn't going to say that I thought he was a great man, because
How do you suddenly cope with that attention? You're in prison, you're isolated from everybody, and suddenly you have that glare of publicity.
Yeah, it's a bit difficult to cope with.
What does it do to your system?
After I've been back a week or two back in the UK, the company sent me up to the Hospital for Tropical Diseases to make sure that I was physically okay. And they also arranged for a head shrink to see me as well. And he interviewed me, and after he'd finished, he said, well, I'm surprised. He said, I had expected, somebody with to be in a pretty bad state. He said, but there's nothing wrong with you at all.
What kept you so sane?
I've heard a lot of people say to me, oh, I couldn't have put up with it. And I said, yes, you can, because you haven't got any choice. I mean, what does rattle you is your impotence, because I'd had all sorts of things happen to me in life before, but I could always do something about it. But when you're a prisoner, you can't do anything. You're absolutely stuck there. You can't communicate with anybody. You're often for hours and hours on your own, and there's nothing you can do. You're either on your own or you're in with a lot of dreadful criminals. I mean, I was frequently in with a lot of murderers and so on. I mean, we had old Abdullah, who had sneaked up on his wife one night while she was asleep and cut her head off. And you've got to sleep with these guys. And you wonder if they're going to do the same with you.
Well, while you've been away, there's been a lot of changes. Your wife, am I right in saying she died?
Yes, she died in the meantime.
How did you find out?
I found it out fairly quickly. About 2 days after she died, Hugh Donaghy, the consul, managed to get to see me, and he'd had difficulty in persuading them that he must see me, and they didn't want him to. They weren't going to give him permission. He said, "Look, it's got to be done, you know, because we've got to arrange for powers of attorney to be handed over." My nephew took it on because there was my wife's funeral had got to be organised and so on, and they began to see the sense, and he came over to see me and said, "I'm afraid I've got very bad news for you." And I thought, oh, they've decided to give me the chop after all. But of course it turned out it was my wife, not me. I was expecting, that was a big shock to me, because I thought if anybody was going to die, it was going to be me. I didn't expect that it was going to be my wife, who had been in perfectly good health when I'd left her.
Has it made you a better person, a stronger person?
Well, you certainly experience a lot of things. I mean, I saw all sorts of things going on in the prison that are quite incredible. I mean, well, of course, the whole experience of being out in the Middle East and not going around in a tourist party, but being on your own and dealing with individuals that you'd never normally meet. I mean, I can recall seeing an old man in the prison, and he got a razor blade and he was making little cuts all the way down his leg, little incisions, and the blood was pouring out of his leg. And I said, "What on earth are you doing?" "Oh, it's good for the legs." And they got this idea that to make hundreds of little incisions with a rusty old razor blade, somehow or other, when your legs were all streaming blood, that it was good for the legs. And I mean, you see all sorts of weird and wonderful things like that.
Well, now, of course, we've made peace, or rather, Libya has made peace with the West. Good or bad?
Well, you know, there's all this talk about the WMD in Iraq and that there weren't any. I'm pretty sure there were. Look, my main contact with the Iraqi Air Force was an Air Force brigadier who went up to Major General afterwards, Amr Rashid Obeidi. And he was one of these of the 55 playing cards, so he was he was all right with me. We were on first name terms. I called him Amr and he called me Jim. But I wouldn't have wanted to be on the wrong side of him, because his officers who worked for him, they were all scared of him. And he asked me if the company would develop something for them which was quite out of order, you know. I mean, we couldn't possibly have provided it. Now, we don't make weapons of mass destruction over there, but we were certainly capable of making what he wanted, which was a counter to the AWACS, American AWACS aircraft. And I said, we can't possibly supply that. I said, A, we don't do it, and secondly, although we could do it, we'd never be allowed to supply it to you. And he said, you don't have to tell them. And he said, after all we want you to do is to design it. We can make it out here. And so if he'd try that with me, I'm quite sure there used to be queues of people trying to get contracts, and I'm sure he must have asked others for. Well, we know he had weapons of mass destruction because he used them on the war against Iran. I'll tell you what I think happened with the Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. I think he shipped them out to Libya. And then the Libyans realised that they could do nothing with this stuff because it was way beyond them. They can't design weapons of mass destruction. They couldn't design a clothes peg, let alone a weapon of mass destruction. The Iraqis could, but Libyans are way, way behind. It's very primitive compared with Iraq. And I think they went there. And then Gaddafi said, I've got these weapons of mass destruction and because I've realised how bad it is, I'm giving them to you in the West. It's all Iraqi stuff. That's what I reckon.